Because freedom is a word, and a lot of different meanings can be behind this word. And I'd like to start with some probably definitions, because freedom itself is just a phenomenon to be explained. And it's a phenomenon that we deal with in our lives, and what is lacking, or probably not lacking, but what is very, what can vary very broadly, is the different explanations of what we perceive as freedom. And such words as determination, self-determination, that are used in the title, it's an attempt to approach to some explanation. And I'll start with some definitions, and I'll start with the initial point of determination, because first of all we become aware of the determination of our activity, and later come to the idea of some freedom. Historically, in human history, people first have become aware of a lot of different pressures and factors and influences and determinations, and then somewhat later they have come to the idea of the possibility of some freedom. If we look at the beginning of human history, we'll see that the idea of determinism as divine determinism was total in early human societies. And well, in ancient Greek mythology, say the attempts to behave against the will of the gods was a very serious challenge, and was possible only for those heroes who were somewhat related to gods, that were the offsprings of divine family in this or that way. So evidently the freedom as such was treated as a divine gift, as a sign of divinity. No mortal, totally mortal, could exercise some, could go against the will of the gods. Only the person with some divine blood, so to say, of some divine origins. So I give a very mechanical description of determination about the connection between some set of processes, and the key explanatory concept is necessity. Necessarily takes place, and I'd like to tell that it's not like logical necessity. It looks like a logical formula, but the necessity is not of logical origins, because if we take some syllogism from A necessarily follows B, so the necessity here is meant according to the criteria of truth. Is something is true, then then the consequences is necessarily also true. But human behavior is built according to quite different principles, and I can tell you, well, you say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. I tell you that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Well, you tell me that I'm wrong. Well, Let it be. Let me be wrong. I agree to be wrong. I will behave as if 2 plus 2 would equal 5. So freedom in this context is the concept expressing the belief that human activity is not totally determined or pan-determined, as V.Frankl said it. He noted that human life is determined but not pan-determined. That is, there is some space for freedom. And it follows from here that, this belief can be interpreted as true or as false. There are some conceptions that treat freedom as just an illusion. We have such an ideal of freedom, and we are sure that we are free, but in fact we are not. Other approaches allow for some true freedom, that is, some space free from being totally determined. But the very important thing is self-determination, because, Mario Bunge, a philosopher who has written a very thick book on causality, he noticed a very important thing that where not everything is totally determined, but most of the processes probably they have some instances of self-determination. That is, it's not determination that is absolute, but some self-sustaining processes that can influence themselves, that can support themselves, and this is the more fundamental fact than causal determination between different processes. And here I introduced the very important idea of the inner world. So the human being possesses the capacity of self-determination just because we possess such thing as inner world. And inner world is something that only human beings do possess, unlike any animals. And this accounts for the gift of freedom as a uniquely human gift. What is inner world? Individual imaginary picture of the world, including the picture of being, non-being, possible, impossible, the desirable, undesirable. That is, we not only reflect the world, the environment, the reality as it is, but we can construct imaginary worlds. We may get any ideas that have very little, very far reference to something we meet in reality. So the consciousness not only reflects the world, so that's why I don't want to speak about mind, because mind is something reflecting the environment, but consciousness is something creating the worlds, creating the inner world. And probably the best illustration of this idea, I found yesterday it's not that I found, I knew it long. I found in Karl Marx writings. So the worst architect differs from the best bee in that before actually building his edifice, he has already built it in his mind. So this is the issue of self-determination. First, initial are the facts of inner world. So we built some project, some edifices. Sartre's concept of projet, a project, is also fits here very well. And some consequences from those those definitions. I already mentioned some of them. I would not dwell on many theories and theoretical discussions. In the second half of 20th century, they took the form of what was designated as hard determinism versus soft determinism. Hard determinism, well, a kind of behavioral version presupposes that everything can be controlled, conditioned, and causal determined. And soft determinism, different approaches to find how we still manage to be free and not just have an illusion of freedom, but an attempt to find some mechanisms that account for some true freedom in the organization of our behavior. And I'd like to summarize the main findings, the main ideas in five points. What can be treated as what makes human freedom possible? Because I believe that freedom is not just an illusion. Some authors who wanted to see just an illusion of freedom rather than true freedom, they said that, well, if we knew all the determinants that act upon us, we would get rid of this illusion. We think that we are free only because we don't know everything that determines us. But in a sense, it contradicts to the regularity known in psychology as fundamental attribution error. In fact, this regularity means that in the position of self-observing subjects, we see the external determinants much easier than the possibilities of our own freedom. When we observe another person, we can see his or her freedom much easier than the factors acting upon his or her. And this regularity contradicts the explanation of illusory freedom. On the contrary, it's easier to see ourselves as determined in an illusory way. The illusion acts in opposite direction. And the last point I'd like how is human freedom possible? The first point is I link here two different concepts from quite different contexts. Multi-level organization of human activity. It's an academic concept linked to cybernetics, synergetics, and so on and so on. And self-transcendence is purely existential idea, treated as a basic human phenomenon, the basic feature of human nature in general, by quite a number of authors, including, for instance, V.Frankl and Amadeo Giorgi, and a number of others. Those two ideas are connected in a very interesting way, just because what is transcendent and where is it transcendent? If we can imagine the human activity, human relation to the world, not as a linear process, but as a multi-level structure, then we can see that we can transcend the regularities acting at one level when we ascend to a higher level. And there are very simple illustrations of this, say the airplane, aircraft. It does not cancel the laws of gravitation when it flies. No, it just adds some new levels, some new regularities, aerodynamics that build some new level, some higher level that supersedes the lower level of gravitational regularities, just add another set of principles, another set of regularities. So the result is that it flies, as if the gravitation wouldn't exist, but it does exist and does act, and it's very important to consider it in the construction in a very precise way. So yesterday during my workshop I quoted this wonderful idea by Hegel: circumstances or urges government only to the extent to which he allows them to do so. This is the idea of transcendence. We may stay at the level where circumstances or urges govern us, or to ascend to a higher level, not to allow them to do so. And a kind of complicated description of this multi-level structure by R.Harre, very prominent British psychologist and philosopher and sociologist, the author of one of the most convincing theories of human agency. A description, I would not dwell upon it, and so V.Frankl's dimensional ontology is very close also to this idea. Frankl describes several levels at which human relations to the world can be built, and stresses that in order to overcome the necessities, the givenness, the facticity existing at biological, psychological levels, we may ascend to a higher level, noetic or spiritual level, and at this level we may find some other options, some other possibilities that help us to behave as if those regularities at lower levels did not exist. The second point is breaks of determination in the stream of human activity. In fact, is the natural causal determination overall? This is the key problem, because the main arguments against the reality of human freedom put forward by natural scientists were that it is not possible, because it can never be possible if all the material world is causally interconnected. Everything makes one system of interconnections, and everything causally determined. There are some overall changes. Then where is the space for human freedom? How can anything be not determined? But several decades ago, very mighty arguments have come to us, the proponents of freedom, from natural sciences, from the study, from the inorganic chemistry, the works by I.Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, who studied the process, the chemical processes, and who opened the bifurcation points He studied the process. He found that there is a kind of processes, even in inorganic nature, when the causal chains break, there is a possibility, there are two options. A process may take one of two possible directions. And there are no factors, no causes that would determine which of these directions the process would take. It's the point where determination breaks, and it's just a matter of chance, random processes, which of the two directions the processes will take. And if even in inorganic nature there are such points, there are such moments, then it's quite logically to assume that in human behavior, in human life, also there are some points, and we may introspectively notice the points, so some periods when our stream of life, stream of activity takes quite different directions. Certainly we may stop and change it, but we must do it with some effort, but there is some regular course of the process. But at some points there is nothing like a regular self-going, self-sustaining course of the process, and we may watch those points of bifurcation, of indeterminacy in our own life. This can also provide an answer to the question on the role of personality in history. Certainly there are historical laws and regularities that act independent of any personalities that even are very influential personalities. Certainly it's not true that a single person, a general person, may completely turn the course of history. But in fact, it depends on the point of time. There are some stable periods and there are bifurcation points in human history. And in those bifurcation points, the role of personality becomes very significant. And in other periods, it is not especially important. It depends on the point in the process. And about this break in determination, if we come back to the psychology of personality, I'd like to recollect a brilliant idea by R.May. The locus of human freedom is the pause between stimulus and response. I usually say to my students that the simplest and probably the most powerful existential technique is stop and count to 10. Or to 20, it doesn't matter. Stop and count to 10. So when you stop and count to 10, you break the chains of determination. And May said that it's this pulse that allows us to throw our own weight to the in favor of this, of that response, and so on and so on. But this pulse is a very important thing. In ancient times, there was the idea of the wheel of fate, and ancient hero was a person who had the power to break, to leave this wheel of fate, to do something not predetermined, not expected of him, but to do something completely unexpected, unpredicted. And this was the essence of the ancient hero. And one more thing wisely noticed by a person, well, I made a mistake that I didn't write his name on transparency because it's a very complicated name. But this is this person that is not very well known in the West. He died 12 years ago. M.Mamardashvili, philosopher, Russian philosopher of Georgian origins. Well, he is the philosopher of the rank. Actually, everyone who knows his writings would confirm that he is the philosopher of the rank of Hegel, Plato, and Heidegger. And after his death, every year a new book of his, based on the transcripts of his lecture, appears. And he proposed a completely new kind of what I call post-existential or radical existential philosophy. It's not like the mainstream existentialism of the 20th century, but it's another stage of its development. And Mamardashvili told in his lectures in Philosopher about, he has given his interpretation of Hamlet. What Hamlet does, this well-known phenomenon of Hamlet that a lot of psychologists try to interpret. Why Hamlet hesitates all the time? Just because he does not want, the circumstances, the situation urges him to respond to stimuli, to behave according to the logic of situation, the logic of social expectations, so on. He does not want to do it. He hesitates. He has to do some, he does it in fact, but he does not respond, directly respond. He makes this pause. He tries to get away of his will. And sometimes, well, in general he fails. But what he is really doing during all his history is just trying to get away of his will of fate, to make those pauses, not to respond to stimuli. The next point is activity mediation by creative consciousness that constructs multiple realities. So, in fact, I already mentioned about this, and I will not dwell upon it more than I had because not so much time is left. I'd like to refer to Salvatore Maddi's theory about the foundations of human free action, what he calls psychological needs in symbolization, imagination, and judgment. This is something that gives us freedom from our biological and social determinants. Why? Just because it allows us to construct in a world, to construct realities, and to live not only in the world of facticity, but also to consider the possibilities that cannot be deduced directly from what is going on. We construct them. So I made an experiment with school graduates, middle school graduates, trying to influence, to organize the process of choosing their career, vocational choice. And I found that the process of constructing possible futures is a very important chain, is a very important process that accounts for the effectiveness of their vocational choice. The fourth important point is the value basis of free action, because you know the rather old distinction of freedom for versus freedom from. It's not enough to be free from any constraints and determinants, but it's important to have something, some value justification, value basis, what for to be free to provide some free actions. That is organizing principles of one's own. That is, we are not using, we are not taking for granted some organizing principles that can be proposed to us by, say, morals, religions, other people's society, and so on. That is that a really free person must elaborate a guiding value principles of one's own, of his or her own. And this is what Carl Jung designated as the principal direction of personal maturation, to elaborate the guiding principles of one's own. Here is a quotation from Nietzsche, who introduced this distinction between freedom from and freedom for. Are you calling yourself free? Your leading idea is what I want to hear, not just what that you've thrown off your yoke. Do you belong to those who have the right to throw off the yoke? There were many of those who had lost their last value when liberated from the slave. Another contemporary author, Joseph Richlock, introduced the concept of telesponding as opposed to responding. A kind of proactive activity directed at the goal, telos, but the main point that is stressed by Richlock is that the essence of human will, free will and responsibility is just the same elaboration of one's own guiding principles. I would also point at the etymology of one well-known word, autonomy. The etymology of this word means a law of one's own. Ancient Greek meaning of the word autonomy, a law of one's own. Personal autonomy means having one's own guiding laws. The fifth point deals with instrumental resources of freedom. That is, it's not enough to want to be free and to have a belief in freedom in order to be free and to behave freely. Mamardashvili said that spiritual actions, like the exercise of freedom, must be based on some muscles. So a small child must have a wish to lift a table, but he is unable to lift a table. He wants, but hasn't enough power to do this. So, says Mamardashvili, it's not enough to want to behave morally in order to behave morally. We must have some intellectual, spiritual, psychological muscles. It's a very important point. It's not just a matter of goodwill. Goodwill is necessary, but not enough. And we must have some resources, to use some resources to make ourselves free. So there can be different kinds of resources to lean on in a choice situation, in a freedom situation, external resources, internal resources, and it's a matter of degrees of freedom, how many options we have. So you see, in fact, the number, our own resources account for the breadth of possible options we will have in a choice situation. Say, if a person who, in many situations, say a person who can speak foreign languages have more possibilities usually as compared to the person who doesn't speak foreign languages. A person who can swim has more possibility as compared to the person who can't swim, and so on, in corresponding situations. So some of the skills, can be of use more often, some less often, but any of them give some additional degree of freedom. But the peculiar situation with the resources is that they both make us more free and less free, because many of our resources, essentially all of our resources that give us some additional possibilities, they try to enslave us. There is one principle that I managed to deduce, to formulate not long ago, and every week I see new and new confirmations of this regularity and principle. That is that all the resources we have, everything that makes us more powerful, more free, more potent, at the same time always tries to enslave us, to submit us to itself. It's very evident in case of money or power or authority. It's quite evident, it's long known. But this is also true for such resources as knowledge, wisdom, relations, sexuality, affection, virtue, essentially for everything. I called it Tolkien principle, that is best exemplified in the image of the ring, Tolkien's image of the ring. It gives enormous power, but it enslaves us. What makes us more powerful does always try to enslave us. So there's a struggle. It doesn't mean that it does always enslave us. It always tries. Such a tendency is always there. But we may struggle with it. We must not necessarily give up. And if we are aware of it well enough. Well, what I mean by enslave? So enslave just to reduce the person to this resource only. So, say a wise scholar may be so proud of his wisdom that this wisdom enslaves him, and he completely dissolves in his wisdom. There is nothing more in his person besides his wisdom. This is the example of this enslaving, so the Tolkien principle. And these are the main points that I think it's important to consider when trying to explain the possibility of human freedom. Now a couple of words about developmental aspects. Probably I'll take 5 minutes more just because we started too late. Just to complete what I was going to say. So we come to purely psychological issues, how to promote the development of human freedom. And I treat freedom as a higher mental function, according to L.Vygotsky. He defined higher mental functions as the uniquely human functions that that have some special properties. Higher mental functions are always social by their origins, mediated by their structure, and voluntary by the way of their functioning. So these are the controlled functions. So there is, for instance, voluntary attention that exists only in humans, that differs from regular involuntary attention that is also there in animals. There are some processes as voluntary memory, and there are more complicated processes that different authors interpreted in terms of higher mental functions. And the way of development, the way of ontogenetic development of higher mental functions is the way that they first they appear in the interaction, in the parent-child interaction, and the child makes some influence upon, or the parent makes some influence upon the child. Say, the function of attention develops in the following steps. First, a parent points to a child to something. Then the child learns to point for a parent to something. Then the child learns to point to oneself in an external, overt fashion. And then the whole process gets interiorized, as Vygotsky calls it, and the function, the internal function of voluntary attention grows. So for instance, I studied the same succession for such function as humor. It also develops according to those steps as a higher mental function. So the freedom passes the same way, and the initial stage is the natural spontaneity, but it's just the genetic root, and the real human freedom goes through a very complicated way. The second point about the developmental conditions that promote the self-determination capacity and human freedom, and a number of authors have pointed at those conditions, and I have a happy possibility to refer to a poster that will be presented in the afternoon today, authored by E.Kaliteyevskaya, my wife, and me, that deals right with this developmental process of human freedom and development, deals with their crossing in adolescent age, deals with adolescent crisis as the crossing of freedom and responsibility in their ontogenetic development. So I can skip the details. And the developmental conditions favorable for this function, as pointed out by a number of authors, are emotional acceptance of the child, encouragement of his/her activity, initiative, and providing some structure. It's an important point. Structure or limits, as some authors called it. Freedom is not possible without limits. There must be some limits that make the freedom possible. R.May pointed at this moment. I found very interesting considerations in a book by Dorothy Lee, cultural anthropologist. The book called Freedom and Culture, one of her books, and another called Valuing the Self. And this is a comparison of different cultures, mainly, mostly North American natives, but not only them. She found that what we usually treat as limitations, restrictions, in fact, it is a structure that makes freedom and activity in general possible. That we could not organize our own activity to make it goal-directed without some structure, some, well, so to say, limitations. So, and adolescent crisis is the crucial point, so I invite you to have a look at the poster. It's not comme il faut, existential psychology in the academic community here in North America, in the United States. Well, so it's something marginal, but in fact, it must not necessarily be marginal. And the point is probably that the traditional psychology deals with human person in the aspects where we are determined and our behavior can be predicted and calculated, and it's 95% of our whole activity, but there are some 5 or 10% where we appear as free persons, as self-determined persons, unpredicted through any constellation of factors that can be objectively described, assessed, and calculated. And this is the space for existential view on human being, existential psychology that is not an alternative to the traditional psychology, but it's a very important addition that complements the traditional objectivistic psychology. And so in order to understand human being fully, we must consider both and to combine those perspectives. So I think that's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dmitry Leontiev, for this intriguing paper about such a huge theme as it is freedom, and you just respected the limits which are necessary to freedom. Stop yourself at this time. Thank you. I don't know if there are some questions arising now.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We have a couple of minutes for this time, and those who want to go for lunch, we can go over. Yeah, I thought what you said was very interesting, but it didn't ring true for me as existential. You created a dichotomy between determinism and freedom. And to me, existential freedom is what emerges through determinism. You're putting the dilemma at the level of events. And at an event level, we can almost be Buddhists and speak like the Buddha and say, like the Buddha, you are not the doer. You are not the one who does these things. The freedom that I think existentialists are talking about is the freedom that emerges when one says yes to determinism. And in that sense, it is not a duality. It is not an antagonism. It's a possibility. And while I find a lot of the arguments that you make about freedom as a possibility at the event level very interesting, I think we're forgetting a much more fundamental freedom.
I completely agree with you. The point is not that I'm presenting freedom determinism issue as a duality. It's just a matter of structure to make some points clear. And if I had more time, I could speak, well, the whole day about all those issues. We would come to this again, because what I did was some probably necessary, I suppose necessary analytical procedure in order to get some idea of the freedom and to make our words as precise as they can be in order to speak about freedom at all. But in general, as far as the general relation between freedom and determinism is concerned, I definitely agree with you. I never said that they are opposed and they may strict dichotomy. I did not say the opposite also either, but just I can't say everything about freedom in 40 minutes.
I would say freedom is multi-level too.
Yeah.
From
Yeah.
self
Certainly. Certainly. I took only some of aspects that I considered probably the most important at here initially.
Yeah, just a short one, and very simple, I think. We are talking about Hamlet, his reluctance to bend to social conventions. The social conventions in North American culture is sometimes very different from what I would like to ask about. In that case, I would like to know how to use this existential freedom to achieve simplicity, public modesty, absence of possessiveness, readiness to respond to the needs of society, deep hostility, toxic acquisitiveness, and high spirituality, alien potential values.
What list is this? What
That's my list. I read this from various readings.
Well, frankly speaking,
Is it possible in this culture, in the North American culture, in your estimation?
you see, I think it. Well, I don't know. I don't belong to North American culture. I cannot respond for the North American culture. But in general, the point. Well, what is crucial for the. Well, in order to be free, I must neither automatically accept cultural norms and expectations, nor nor rebel against them, reject them, and so on. So a free person filters everything. He or she takes what he considers to be worthwhile and rejects the rest. So it's a.
You're saying it's within the structure and it's got certain limitations that is.
In fact, social expectations and social structures are also multi-level. So there is no society, single society. We live in a set of social structures of different range, and some of them are parallel to one another. Some of them include others. For instance, for us, as we grow, family is the first society, and the family gives the first set of social rules and restrictions. Then we learn some other societies, a peer group, school class. Then we learn still more different societies, religious community, professional group, and so on and so on. And each of those groups contains the whole set of values and norms and regulations, so that they may contradict each other, or sometimes not contradict. And then we learn something about the national values and rules, then about the all human. So, and there is nothing like society, like a single society. There is society. I don't live in a society. I live in a multilevel system of societies.
My question is, I see your concept to be more a cognitivistic concept of freedom, which relies on conscience